Hi everyone, welcome back to Newegg TV. My name is Paul, and today I'm going to be doing a couple small form factor Mini-ITX builds. There's a few reasons that you might be interested in doing a small form factor build. One of them is obviously size. These builds take up less space, as you can see by the diminutive cases that we're using here. One of them might be power consumption, and Mini-ITX builds definitely do consume less power as compared to their full-size mid-tower or full-tower brethren. And then finally, you might be looking for a cost-effective solution, maybe something that's just meant for internet browsing, web surfing, and maybe watching the offhand video. And then also they work great for home theater PCs, and both of these have plenty of capabilities in those areas. So first off, let's talk about the parts that I've chosen, and we have two builds again. One on here on my left is an AMD-based build, and one on my right is an Intel-based build. So first off, let's go over our AMD build, and it's primarily focused around this Zotac Fusion series motherboard. The motherboard itself gives you, well, not just a motherboard, but it also gives you a CPU, GPU, also known as an APU, as dubbed by AMD, that's right under this heatsink there. Also gives you the heatsink, which is passive, so it makes no sound, which is great for a home theater PC. And it also gives you all the nice extras that come along with this board, such as the integrated video of the Fusion E350, so you can have HDMI out and DVI out, so again, great for home theater. Lots of audio options as well, and that takes care of a big old chunk of what you'd need in order to build a computer. This board uses notebook memory, little 204-pin SODIMMs, DDR3, so we have a 4 gig kit here from Crucial, DDR3 notebook memory. We're going to be using this little 2.5-inch Seagate Momentus XT hard drive. It's 500 gigs, and the Momentus XT is a hybrid hard drive, so it has both a mechanical hard drive in there. It also has a solid-state memory cache, so it gives it a little bit of extra pep. For instance, after you've loaded Windows a few times, it will remember that, preload it to the SSD cache in there, and you will have a faster boot time. So that will speed up your performance as compared to a typical mechanical hard drive. Moving along, we need a bracket because our case here only has a 3.5-inch slot, so we're going to use this little plastic bracket from Bytech to mount our 2.5-inch drive in that 3.5-inch slot. Here's our Rosewill Mini-ITX case. It is small and it gets the job done. It also includes a 250-watt power supply. So there's your case and your power supply all in one there. And then finally, we want an optical drive, and since we are planning to set this up as a potential home theater PC, we went with the Blu-ray drive. It's also part of the reason why I chose a case with a full 5.25-inch bay instead of a slim bay, is because you can get these Blu-ray drives, the full-size ones, for a bit cheaper these days than you can for the slim ones. Although if you were looking for a different case, there's a lot of them out there, and some of them do have the slim drives, which do look a little bit sleeker, but bear in mind that you do need to get a slim 5.25-inch optical drive for that as well. So here's our 12-speed Blu-ray combo DVD burner drive from Samsung. And moving along, here we have our Intel build, and our Intel build is once again using a Zotac Mini-ITX motherboard. This time it's an Intel-based motherboard, and it is a Z68. This is the Zotac Z68 ITX Wi-Fi motherboard. So we have an 1155 socket there for a Sandy Bridge CPU. We also have a few upgrades here. So we have a 16-speed full-length PCI Express slot. Now you could drop in a discrete video card there. This build is not going to be able to use one of those, but I'll give you a few tips if you are interested in that. We also have lots of the other stuff that we saw with our AMD board, such as, once again, the built-in Wi-Fi. We also have USB 3.0, and we have plenty of sound options. Again, great for a home theater PC. Let's go over what we're going to plug into this motherboard. We have a separate CPU this time, so we're using an Intel Core i5. This is the 2400S. 2400S, the S means it's got a lower TDP, so this is a 65-watt CPU instead of a 95-watt CPU. And that's very important because we're using a small case and a pretty small power supply, just a 220-watt in there, so we want to make sure we can fit in under that threshold. Also, since it's a slim case, we don't have much space for a heatsink fan. So we're not going to use the stock one here with our CPU. We're going to use the Slim X3 that's made by Thermaltake. Speaking of Thermaltake, we also have this Thermaltake case right here. This is the Element Q. Once again, we have a full-size 5¼ inch slot, and that's for, or 5¼ inch bay. That's for our Blu-ray drive. Again, it has a built-in power supply, 220 watt from Thermaltake, and this will be a pretty ideal fit for our hardware. Now, if you were thinking about building a Mini-ITX build, and you wanted to use, for example, this motherboard over here, and you wanted to add a discrete video card, that can give you much more gaming capability. We're going to be going with the integrated graphics from our Sandy Bridge CPU. But you probably would not want to go with this case. You would want to look for a case that both has a more substantial power supply and also that has a double slot for a dual slot video card. Let's take a look at the rest of our hardware. For storage over here, we're going to be taking advantage of our Z68 chipset. One of the features of the Z68 chipset is a little something called Smart Response technology that's made by Intel. So we have a 500 gig Seagate hard drive here. That's just the momentous 7200.4 500 gig 2.5 inch hard drive. We're going to be pairing that and using Smart Response technology with this OCZ Serial ATA2 SSD. I should know what SSDs are. This is a Vertex 30 gig SSD. It's an inexpensive SSD, and it's a great way that you can get a lot more performance out of your storage by pairing the two of those together. I'll show you how that works. We also have 4 gigs of G.skill memory, again DDR3, to go in our memory slots there for dual channel. Again, we have our Bitech 3.5 inch to 2.5 inch converter. That's going to hold both of our 2.5 inch drives right there. And finishing everything off, once again, we have our Samsung full-size 5¼ inch 12-speed Blu-ray and DVD burner combo drive. For the most part, all you're going to need with these builds is a standard Phillips head screwdriver, and we're going to get started by opening up our case and taking a look inside to get a good idea of the layout and plan our cable management. The case is held on in the back by 4 simple Phillips head screws, and the top pops off just like that. And just to get it out of the way, I'm going to pop in the motherboard's input-output shield that came with my Mini-ITX motherboard. And I'm going to take a look at the layout inside here. We have our power supply right up at the top, and that's going to be there, so there's not much we can do about that. Up here at the top is our 5¼ inch bay where our optical drive is going to go. Our hard drive is going to drop in right below that. And then we really just have the motherboard and then where we're going to wire the cables. So we want to make sure that we have our serial ATA plugs here. We're going to need one for the hard drive, one for the optical drive. We're also going to need to route our motherboard power connector over there, 24-pin power. We also have our case's front panel connectors that enable the power switch and reset light and all that good stuff. And then finally we just have our USB and our HD audio jacks. Beyond that, we're just going to need to plug in a few serial ATA cables. And at this point, since our Zotac motherboard already has the passive heatsink pre-installed as well as the APU in there, really all I'm going to do outside the case is plug in our memory. And I should remember to grab that. Remember, the memory is notched, so we can only drop it in one way. I have 2 of them in 2 slots. Turn this around so you can see it. It snaps in, and these little clamps lock in place, and we're all set. And next up, to install the motherboard. Mini-ITX boards are pretty simple when it comes to mounting them to the case. There are only 4 mounting points, 1 at each corner. So I'm just going to slide the board in from the side here as carefully as I can. Make sure you don't need standoffs, or make sure you maybe do need standoffs, again, depending on your case. This case already has little punched up standoffs, so we don't need to worry about those. But you might need to mount them, depending on the case you're using. Once we've got it lined up here, I just need to bolt in the 4 bolts to hold it in place. Next is motherboard power. We have a 20+4 pin plug here, and I'm just going to plug that in. That is all the power that this motherboard needs. So that's all set. Next up is the most pain in the butt part of building a computer. That is the front panel header connectors, but we might as well get it out of the way. If you see right here on the PCB itself, they've actually listed nicely for us what is the power LED, HDD LED, and power and reset switches. That is nice of them. Bear in mind, for the switches, power and reset, it doesn't matter which pins, which way you orient the plug going into the pins. But for the power LED and hard drive LED, it does matter. So we see on our power LED pin right there, a little plus. I've looked at the manual to find out that these first 2 pins here are the positive pins for the power and hard drive LEDs. So I'm going to put the positive there into the positive, the negative into the negative, white being the negative lead for the header there. And we're all set. Now we're just going to plug in also the hard drive LED and the power reset switch. Got it. And lastly, for our front panel connectors, we have USB and HD audio. A couple USB ports up there, so we're going to plug this into the headers here on the motherboard. Also HD audio. Generally, if given the option between HD audio and AC97, I go for the HD. Remember, these are keyed, so you can only plug them in one way. And also make sure that you don't, for instance, plug a USB plug into a FireWire header. But now our front panels are all connected, and we can work on tucking away some of the cables to make sure we have as much airflow through this case as possible. And here we have our 2.5-inch Seagate Momentus XT, which we're going to mount to our 2.5-inch to 3.5-inch adapter. And we just need to put 4 bolts in right there to get that in place. But what we're going to do here is actually remove the front panel of this case. It just has 4 clips here that we need to push down on in order to pop off, and that will come off forward, and that will allow us to drop in our 5.25-inch drive, which we need to install from the front. You can drop it in from the top as well, but depending on the length, you might have a tougher time doing that. Now we're just about done to our last step, which is plugging in our drive. So we have 2 drives, one hard drive and one optical drive. So we're going to need 2 data cables, which we connect to our serial ATA plugs right there. So I'm going to get these started here by plugging them in. And here's where you're getting to the final steps of cable management. You want to take a look at where your where the areas are in the case that are going to be generating heat, which is pretty much going to be your APU right there. And it's got this power supply right above it. That's the only fan in the case that's going to be drawing heat away from that. These cables, however, you do want to tie down, wrap around however you can to keep them out of the way. Route them over so you can plug them into your drives. And then lastly, we'll be taking our Blu-ray drive here, and from the front of the case, sliding it in like so. Of course, I should wait to do that until I plug in the drive below it. Once that's in, we just bolt these all down, get all the cables connected as well as the power plugs, and we're all set. I'm dropping in my optical drive now, and I want to make sure to plug it in before I slide it all the way back, because otherwise it's a little bit of a tight squeeze. There we go. And now I want to make sure this is lined up with the front of the case, so I'm going to pop on my front panel and make sure that at the position here that I'm bolting the drive in on the side matches up with the front of the case here so that the drive bay door will be able to open. And now I'm going to drop the case housing back on so we can close it all up. There we go. I just need to bolt on the back, and while I'm at it, they give me 4 little feet, so I'm going to stick those on the bottom. And now we're all set. We're going to fire this up for the first time, and there she goes. Wow. It is so quiet. I can barely hear anything, but it is booting. I'm going to go ahead and get Windows loading on this one. Can you guys hear anything? My mic's right here. That's how loud this is. It's not loud at all. Anyway, I'm going to start loading Windows on this one and get started on the other build. And now onto our Intel build with the Z68 chipset and all, and our 2400S, and our Thermaltake Element Q case. If you look at the design of this case as compared to our Roswell case we were just using, the similarities are uncanny, and we have just a bit of clearance here between the power supply and the motherboard. So first things first, we're going to need to mount everything to the motherboard first. That means installing the CPU, installing our heatsink fan onto the CPU, and also dropping in our memory to make sure that we get that all in there before we install the motherboard into the case. So first things first, our LGA 1155 socket here, we want to release the pressure plate just like that. We have a piece of plastic in here that's protecting all of our delicate little pins. We want to carefully remove that. Make sure you never touch those little pins in there again. They are very, very delicate. Next, we take our CPU itself. We want to be sure to align the 2 notches on the side of the CPU with the 2 notches in the socket here and here. We want to drop it in straight down and not apply any pressure to it. Just like that, as best we can. Again, no need to push down on the CPU at all. The pressure plate here will do all the work. The pressure plate installs like that, hooks onto that other side. Here's where we can apply a little bit of torque to get that arm down and locked in place, and our CPU is installed. Next on, the heatsink fan. Installation of our Slim X3 heatsink fan from Thermaltake is fairly simple. It's got a couple mounts you need to bolt to the bottom there. There's two positions on these for 775 and 1156 or 1155. You want them in the outer position for that. I'm going to set that on its back, and then I'm going to actually mount the motherboard on top of that. First, we need some thermal grease. I'm going to use Thermaltake thermal grease. We're just going to put a dollop in the middle. We want about the size of a grain of rice or a pea, or right in between. And we're just going to let the pressure spread that out. Next, I'm going to take the entire motherboard, since it's so small and so light, and I'm going to drop it right down on top of this, like so. Apply a little pressure to keep it in place, and then we have 4 bolts, which I've conveniently hidden under the motherboard. Here they are, which I'm going to tighten down to keep this in place. I'll just start with doing them by hand, and then I'll give them some torque with the screwdriver. Alright, so now that our CPU heatsink fan is installed, I'm just going to plug in our 4-pin fan header right there. Now is a good time to reassess and take a look at the airflow in your case, as well as how your cables are going to be managed. For instance, we have a heatsink fan on top of our CPU, and it does have a fan on it, not just a heatsink. So as compared to our AMD build, we have an extra fan in here. So we have this fan, which is actually going to be pulling air down, and we also have another fan in the power supply here, which is going to be pulling air up. You might consider going with a different fan orientation. You could flip this fan over so it would actually be pulling air up from the CPU. It's really just a matter of preference and also a matter of testing. It's a good idea if you're really concerned about temperatures in a small form factor case like this. Don't be afraid to install everything, get your system booted up, take some temperature readings, and then play around with the configuration to see what works best. I'm going to leave this as is because I'm wagering that there's going to be enough distance between the two fans that they're both going to be able to function properly. But before I drop this in, I'm going to also install the memory here to make sure that I don't have a tight fit once it's actually installed into the case. This is full-length DDR3 memory, and as you should remember, there is a notch there. It's off-center to make sure you can only plug it in one way. Alright, now that our memory's in, same with the other Mini-ITX board, we just want to carefully slide it in from the side here. Of course, we can't forget our motherboard's input-output shield. Just going to pop this into place here, like so. Well, we can forget that, but it's best not to. And next we're going to drop in our motherboard. Again, just like with our AMD build, we're going to carefully drop this in from the side and line it up both with the input-output shield in the back as well as the 4 mounting points right here. And now we just need to bolt it in. And again, just connecting our front panels here. A couple plugs to plug in right here. We have our supplemental CPU power. We also have our front panel audio. You'll notice this is actually an 8-pin EPS plug, which normally would require an 8-pin plug from the power supply. We have a 4-pin plug coming from this power supply because it is a lower wattage power supply. Since we're using a lower wattage CPU, the 2400S, this should be just fine. So we're just going to plug this in. Remember, these are keyed, so you can't plug that into the wrong plug. And but bear in mind that if you are putting together a higher power Mini-ITX system, you will want to use maybe a different case or a different power supply, probably something with a little bit additional cooling if you're going to go with something like, say, a 2500K or a 2600K and you want to actually maybe do some overclocking. Again, since this is the low power CPU version that we're going to be using here, should be fine with just a 4-pin. And just a couple more here for the motherboard. We have our 24-pin power connector. I'll get that all plugged in nicely. And then we have over here on this side our front panel USB port. This is for USB 2.0. Again, bear in mind that when you're doing cable management in these mini systems, you do want to get them tightened down. But if you're doing some testing, especially if it's a system that you're not familiar with or you're building for the first time, you might want to just plug everything in loosely, get everything booted up. You can even wire your drives outside of the case just to get into Windows so you can do some quick testing. and that'll make sure that your temperatures are within reason before you actually go to the trouble of tying all your cables down. And lastly here, I'm going to be installing my drives, and since I already showed you guys this procedure with the other case, we're not going to show too much detail. However, I did want to point out that I have 2 serial ATA power plugs here, and I have 3 devices to plug in, so I did need to scrounge up a Molex to serial ATA connector there for our optical drive to make sure we have power for all those. Also, I have, of course, 3 serial ATA data cables. I'm going to wire everything loosely in here so I can just get the system booted up and start doing some testing, make sure my thermals are okay. Also, since the OCZ Vertex drive SSD here is going to be used for caching, I don't need to worry about plugging that in until I actually get Windows set up, because you set up the smart response technology in Windows. Also, I like to keep my drives unplugged except the drive that I'm loading Windows to when I'm loading Windows for the first time, just to make sure it puts the 100 meg boot sector on the right drive. And we're back. I know I skipped over a few things here, but just to bring you guys up to speed, what I have done is I connected my mechanical hard drive outside of the case. I went ahead and loaded Windows onto that just to confirm that my temperatures were within a reasonable value. I determined that that was okay, so I went ahead and wired up the rest of the case. So all my drives are installed here. I got both drives in this little bay down here. Got my 5 1/4 inch optical drive up top, and I've tied down the cables at least as much as I can. My goal here is bearing in mind that I have grates on both sides of the case. I wanted to keep these sides open, so there on that side you can see, as well as over here. These are fairly open, and that will let heat escape through there. So I am just going to finish this up real quick by popping the side panel of the case, or case cover I should say, back on, and let's give it a quick startup to see how she runs. And now our second build is all put together, so I'm just going to go ahead and boot it up real quick to give you guys a quick look-see. That's actually going to wrap it up for this section of the video, the build section for both of our systems here. And while I'm at it, let me lean real close here again so you can hear. Can you hear anything? I can't hear anything. A little bit of fan noise, but barely anything. Even with that Thermaltake X3 Slim CPU cooler, barely any sound from either of these machines. I'm quite happy with them, I must say. We are going to do a part 2 for this video, and that's going to include some software testing. I'm also going to show you guys setting up smart response technology with this build that we have right here. We're going to do Blu-ray playback, as well as local video file playback, as well as streaming video playback from the internet. We might even throw in some light game testing, since these do have integrated HD 2000 graphics over here and AMD Fusion graphics over here. That's going to wrap it up for today's video. I'm Paul with Newegg TV. We hope you've learned a little bit more about small form factor Mini-ITX builds. Just wanted to say thank you to all of our sponsors who have provided hardware for these systems. And we will see you next time on Newegg TV. Watch out for part 2 coming soon.